Yeah, so we're going to dive out to our command line now. Well, we're going to be able to see how we can manage our container-based services. Among other things, we're going to be taking a look at port mapping and volume mapping. Come on, let's go through and find that command line. So the first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is use our alias command to remind ourselves that we have got an alias for Docker. So we can use Docker, which is going to relate to Sudo and Docker. With that done, we're going to go through and use our Docker and container run. Remember, I can just use Docker run, but the tidier way of running this is Docker container run. -D for detached. We're going to assign it a name. Remember, if we don't assign it a name, we'll have one of those weird two names being assigned to it, which makes it more difficult to manage. And then we can assign the name web. And we want to base it on the Nginx web server image. Now, we don't have this yet, so we're going to see that we don't need to pull our images down ahead of time. Our images can be brought down as we create the container. So we can see that we are unable to find it, so we go through and pull down the different layers that make up our Nginx image. Again, it's coming from our Docker image registry. And now that's all up and running, and it's running in the background. -D is to run it detached. If I then go through and clear my screen, if we go back and look at my IP and link ls, we can see that we've got one of our virtual network cards again, the bottom entry. So that's then my container connected to our Docker 0 network. If we want to check the IP address that has been assigned, we can inspect the container. So Control and L, and then Docker, and then our container, inspect. If I just run it, of course, we're going to get a lot of information, especially if I do assign it a name. Remember, the container name was web. Now, we might be lucky and be able to see the information I want, and I can actually see the IP address. We can go through and filter based on the JSON data, but sometimes it's easier just to pass it through to grep. If we use -I, we don't care about the case, and then look for IP address. So we can see the IP address of our web server, and then we can go through and use curl 172.17.0.2. The curl's not a browser, so we only get a very simple outline without interpreting the HTML tags, but we can see then the web page that we've got. Now, one thing accessing it on this IP address is a private IP address to this host network. So in general, without me setting up any routing rules, we're not going to be able to connect to this from outside of our host. Whereas if we use port mapping, we would be able to connect to our host's mapped port and connect into our system. So that's a good idea, as is replacing the web content. So one way we can replace the web content, let's just make sure that we bring this container down. So we can use our Docker container and then rm -f because it is actually running. So remove will delete it, but won't remove running containers. -f, the force, will make sure then the container is stopped. And we want to bring down our web container. If I create myself then a directory, we'll just call it, let's say, web, add then my web assets to this. For me, it's just going to be a simple, hello. And we can redirect that through to web and index.html. Obviously, we could write a lot more HTML code, but we'd probably be adding content from our existing website, including all of the assets that go with the web page. But this is just going to be a simple demonstration. So that gives me a directory that I can map to a directory inside of my container. When I now go through and run my container, I can go back up. We're going to be adding in then the -v for volume. So I want to, on the host machine, home, Vagrant, and web. is going to be mapped through, so colon to /usr/share/nginx/HTML. That's a directory in our container. Make sure we have got that right. It won't fail if we've got it wrong, but it will create the directory structure if it doesn't exist. Obviously, it needs to be the right directory structure for the web page to show. We can use our port mapping, so -p, and then we're going to map port 8000 on our host operating system, any port that's not in use, really, and then to port 80, the web server port in our container. With that up and running, I can then quite simply do a curl localhost. I don't need to check the IP address. And then on port 8000, and we get to see my customized web page. And we are now listening on our host operating system on port 8000 for our incoming web connections. But this then gives us an idea of how we can start creating our microservices inside of containers and being able to connect to those microservices.